Having completed the stability test, we can now move on to mobility testing. And in exactly the same manner as we found at the craniovertebral joints, we can have symmetrical and asymmetrical hypo and hypermobilities. We'll start off looking at the asymmetrical hypomobilities, as these are the more common conditions that the patient will come in complaining of. We will do exactly the same thing as we did in the craniovertebral joints. That is, we will flex or extend the head and then side bend around the axis of that segment. And the interpretation of this test is the same. That is, if we have a right side flexion hypomobility in flexion, we're looking at the left side of the segment being the hypomobile. If it's an extension dysfunction, it will be on the same side as the side flexion hypomobility. Again, it's important that we maintain the movement around that axis. And we can move through the neck quite quickly. So, looking at extension first, we will extend the segment just by lifting up on the transverse process. There is no fixation with this, and with that segment in extension, we'll side bend the head left and right, and as we do so, we will provide a contralateral translation. So again, we're looking at both the physiological movement and the arthrokinematic movement of the whole segment, taking it through its full range of extension on either side. For flexion, we will flex at that segment, like so. Ensure that you keep the craniovertebral joints in neutral, otherwise the posterior ligamentous system will tighten things up. And again, side bend left and right, like so, and move yourself down the neck. Having determined that we have a hypomobility, we need to find out which tissue is the hypomobile one, whether we're dealing with a facet joint hypomobility or an uncovertebral joint hypomobility. We can test the arthrokinematic movement out for both of these joints. For example, in the facet joint, when we extend the neck, the superior facet of the zygapophyseal joint will glide posteriorly and inferiorly. As we flex it, it will glide superiorly and anteriorly. By positioning our fingers on the back of the articular process, we can glide it down or glide it up, and we'll get an idea of how normal that glide is, particularly as to what the end feel of that glide is. So if we look at the bones, and I'll turn them on their side so that you can see where we're going to, hopefully, with this. In this position, with the patient laying supine again, and with them flexed at that segment, I'll put my finger onto the exposed ridge of the facet joint, and then I will draw the superior facet upwards, like so. Now, it's not that you're going to get inches of movement here. More importantly, is the end feel normal? Okay, so we'll be on either side with the segment flexed and just draw it up on each side and get a feel for side-to-side differences, and also differences from above and below. For extension, we'll put the neck into its extended position, or at least that segment, and we'll come onto the back of the articular process, compress the two joint surfaces together, and then glide it inferiorly. And the orientation of the facet will guide that glide. And again, we're looking for the amount of glide that occurs, but again, more importantly, the end feel. So if we come back to living tissue, for flexion, I'll pick a segment, say in the middle of the neck, and we'll flex the neck up, palpate the edge of the articular process, the inferior articular process, the superior facet, and we'll simply pull it up just with finger pressure, so I'm doing this movement with it. And I'll just gauge the end feel and compare it to the other side and above and below. For extension, we'll extend the head into that position, and now I'll push on that articular process, compressing it against its partner and then gliding it inferiorly. And again, compare left and right, superior and inferior. This will give us information about the uncovertebral, the apophyseal joint. to test the unconvertible glide, we have a different orientation. If we look again at the bone, the facet joints are orientated in this direction, superiorly and inferiorly, and they're coronal. The unconvertible joints are orientated a little more obliquely, and they tend to be in a more sagittal direction, and the glide will be across the vertebra towards the opposite hip. And these tests can be done in neutral. So we'll just put our fingers on the transverse process and the neural arch, the soft part again, and then we'll glide down towards the opposite hip and compare to the other side. Like so. Having tested for this type of dysfunction in this manner, we can come to some conclusions as to whether we're dealing with an asymmetrical or a symmetrical dysfunction. If we have a symmetrical dysfunction there, then the asymmetrical test will be positive bilaterally. If it's an asymmetrical test, it will be positive only unilateral. That is, only one side flexing instead of both side flexions will be positive. It is not, therefore, really necessary that we do a specific symmetrical test for a cervical segment. We can correlate it with the asymmetrical test very easily. And these tests can be done quickly and efficiently, so the patient is put through the least amount of discomfort and the least amount of inconvenience.